So this is also H2. We want to display data something in this format. Now, because I want to apply the same format, let's take the same thing here as well. And this is going to be name2 and let's say 45. So at the moment we have two different records which we want to show, and that is also getting displayed at the bottom. Now let's give some more formatting to this so that it appears like a card, right? So what I'll do is I'll just take one class for division, let's say personal, pers. It's a personal information class. I'm going to give some width, let's say 300 pixels. Let's also give border first of all so that we get the idea how does it look. I'll say 1 pixel solid and I'll make it black. So we will have some border around it. And next thing I'm going to say class is equal to pers for both the components. Now each division is a kind of card view which is displaying some information which you normally see on any e-commerce site, right, where you have different cards. So now let's give some margin and padding also. I'll give padding, let's say 10 pixels. Margin, we give 10 pixels. I'll also make it on the same line. So I'll say line block. So now we have the data getting displayed here, right? Let me resize this a bit. Imagine that you have 100 records like this. Right now we have two records, right? Name1 and name2. You may have 100 records like this. All 100 records, you will have 100 divisions. That's how you deal with it. If you are thinking of HTML and CSS, that's how you do it. But when I say that you go for a component-based architecture, you create one component like this, the one which you are seeing right now at the bottom. We have two different components. You can think in that direction. The first and second component, each is having some data. So this name1, this name2, this 34 or maybe 45, all these informations can be passed to one component and you can keep on repeating this component. That's the charm of component-based architecture. Right now I'm using CodePen. You can use other tools also. We can use VS Code, or generally for React there is a better option called Code Sandbox, right? There you can try everything online. But right now I wanted to show you that this is what HTML is. Now let's try to convert the very same thing into a component-based architecture. How do we do that? Let's try that. So for implementing the React architecture, at least in this CodePen, I will have to switch on few things. So what I'll do, I'll click on settings. Later on, we will be working with VS Code or others, so you do not need all these things. But in CodePen, I can show you the HTML and then I convert into React. That's why I'm using CodePen, and it is just for this particular session, right? But at least for now, or even in future, if you try to refer the same thing in some other online editor, where by default React is not available, then you can make it available in somewhat similar way. So let me do that. Here what I need is I need to select, there is a preprocessor called Babel, right? There is a reason, and that as we go on with React, you'll understand what Babel is, what is a preprocessor, and there are other things also. There are two more libraries which you need to add. The first is always going to be the React library. Let me just search for the React. So I can use any version of React because now we are working with React 17. I'm selecting React 17. Right, I'll just remove this. The next thing is we are going to select the React DOM. So I'm going to click here. Right, so we have two libraries included. Later on, I'll explain you when you create the React project, how does this thing gets included. But in short, right now, I have made React and React DOM, two libraries available for this particular project. All right, now I can start writing the React coding. What I want to do now, I do not want this kind of HTML where everything is getting repeated. I want to make this in component-based architecture or component-based approach. Remember, when you think of a web page, the header, the footer, the sidebar, whatever you think of, everything becomes one component and you can add and remove the component whenever you want to. That is the advantage of component-based architecture. Let's try to create a component. I'm going to say function. Let's say I want to create a component named personal information. I'll say pers info, personal information. That's the component I want to create. Because you are creating a component in React, that means you are going to create a function only. It's a function, right? This is going to be a component. What next? The next thing is I will be writing the HTML here in JavaScript. So this HTML which you see right now, I do not want it here. Instead, what I'll do, I'll put here. But if I put directly like this, it is not valid. What I have to do, I have to return this HTML in this JavaScript section. Remember, I'm writing the HTML inside JavaScript. How come it is valid? Because this Babel is acting as a compiler, or you can say it's a transpiler, which helps me to write the HTML inside JavaScript. This is number one. Number two, the HTML which you write inside JavaScript is called as the JSX. That's what we call it. And every function, that is every component, is going to return this JSX. So ideally, what will I do? I'll say return. Now remember, because I'm returning JSX, I'm going to open the parentheses and not the curly brackets. And inside this, I will have this component, right? So now you have the division, you have the component, right? So it also means now I won't be taking this HTML, at least for the moment. I can remove this. Now I want that there has to be personal info component itself, right? So normally in React application, in the HTML section, you can write like this, personal info, something like this. Here it won't happen, but once we switch to complete React application, that's how it is going to be. So now you have a custom component, right? There is no such thing called pers info in HTML, isn't it? But you are going to create something which is custom, right? We'll see that. At the moment, let's say we have a division. I'm just showing that there is person one, right? And let's say I end this division here, right? And there is one more division. Let's say ID is equal to person 2. And this is also the second division, right? Now, what you want is that you want to show the component here, right? So for that, what React says is that there is something called React DOM, which has a method called render. And here you can say that what you want to render. So here I will say personal info is the component which I want to render. Where do you want to render? I want to render that inside document dot, I'll say the JavaScript thing I am writing here, get element by ID. This I'm going to use, let's say, person 1. You see this? Now the component is displayed here. Next component you want to draw is again the person 2 component. Mind you that this is not a good practice writing render twice, but we live with this at the moment, right? So now if I just scroll down here, we have 2 components. Perfect. But then there is an issue. The issue is that we have the same data, isn't it? Name 134. Why? Because here is the same data. So ideally what you can do, you can create attribute on the component, right? Let's say if you know that your component needs some data, then that data will be passed as attributes as you pass the data to the HTML element, right? So what I can do, I can pass the data here. Let's say I want the name that equals to, for example, I'm passing name1, and the second is, let's say, age, which I'm passing 34 in first case, right? In the second example, I'll say name is equal to, let's say the data is name2 and age is 45. The data which you are passing here as an attribute, that is passed to this function's parameter, simple. And that is passed as an object literal. So you write obj here, doesn't matter. But ideally we call this as props. So what happens? The data which you are passing as attribute in the components tag, that is passed as an object literal in the function. So this means now you have something called props. Remember, you can give any name you want to. We generally refer this as props. Properties, that is, properties of the component. Now these properties, what you're going to do, you are going to write here. So ideally, because this is an object literal, you'll say props dot name. But if you write like this, you see it is the fixed value coming, not the dynamic one. You want the value of it, so you are going to use the curly bracket to show that. And let me do that. Now you see, first says name1 and the second says name2. All right. Now, next thing, you want to make changes for the age as well. So let's say props dot age. So now both the values are dynamic. This is done. What is next? The next thing is, you should never write React DOM.render 2 times. Even in your React application, we will see, no matter how many components you have, but the React DOM.render will be only once. We will also understand the architecture of React application, but at a later stage. Here we just try to understand how this thing works. This means when you say React DOM.render, right, that should happen only once. And this personal info, whatever you write, you can write that with a single element. That element is a JSX element. So I can say, for example, let personal detail, something like this, is equal to, this is JSX. So I'm using the parentheses here. And inside this, I will have one container, whichever container you give, I give division, right? And then this pers info which we have returned, let me just cut this thing and paste it here. Similarly, let me cut the second data also and paste it here, right? So now we have two components like this. And even in HTML section, we'll see this in React application, we will have just one division called root in the main HTML file. And here what you want to display is the personal details, whatever details you have, and where you want to display inside the root. Now you see, now it is working the absolute same way. Normally we see that when we give the class in HTML, with React we give class name. So now this is what the component-based architecture is. Let me add one more component now. This is the data which we are fixing, but eventually this data will be, let's say, maybe from some AJAX call, isn't it? So you just paste it here. Let's say name3, right? And you have some other details also, 23. So what you have done is, we just have simple 2, 3, 4 lines in a component. But otherwise, if a component has a lot of functionalities, then what you do is you just type that component name, pass the attribute, pass the data, which is treated as props, and your job is done. So probably from this, you also get the idea what is props, right? Props is nothing but the information we pass to the component. And also, whenever you pass, you have the attribute to pass the data. There will be a lot of dynamism in this, but this is just a basic idea about what is a component-based architecture. Alright, so now let's talk about relative questions. The first question is, what is JSX and how to write it in program? So JSX is nothing but the HTML you write inside the JavaScript. How to write it? So basically, you write it like this. Or you may have a declaration that let A is equal to, you open the parentheses and inside that you write the HTML. Do make sure that you have a parent container. It might be a division, it might be other containers as well, which we will see as we move ahead with React tutorial. But at the moment, you can consider this as div, and you have other HTML elements inside this. The second question is, what is props in a component? So here we have seen that the attribute, the detail, the information which we pass with the component we create, the custom element we create, that is passed to this function as parameter, and the data passed as an object literal to this function is basically the props or properties. So in other words, it is the attributes which you pass with the component. And the last question is, how do you show props value? So when you have to display the props value, this is how you do it. You use the curly bracket and you try to show the value. If you directly put it, it won't show. So it's a dynamic value which you need to refer. And for that, you write it like this. You have curly brackets and you display it.